Hi, and welcome back to Echoes and Communities, where we explore how the past echoes through our futures. I'm Kim.
And I am Moira. As you can see, she has finally condescended to allow me out of that horrid basement office and offered me some hospitality. How thoughtful.
And we are your hosts for Echoes and Communities, and this is episode 2. So as you can see, I changed things up a bit. I was so nervous those first few times, and I really want to have fun with this. So I'm going to get more comfortable, and I hope you do too, because we love doing this, and we want you to love joining us. For those of us who were here for the last episode, a very warm welcome back. And thanks so much for just the views and the shares and even the texts I got, all of that stuff that just made me feel so good. Please subscribe and shoot a comment in. I really do answer all of your comments, and I would love to hear from you. Plus, it helps get these episodes to more people who will enjoy them. As you guys have no doubt figured out, I am pretty brand new to this. This stuff has been a real learning curve. I have no staff, no sponsors, just you guys and some great software. So real quick, I want to give a shout out to Shadow, Jesse, and the kiddos. And as I think I said before, I don't like to put the kids' names out there, but you know who you are, guys. And I want to thank them for their support as well as the tech help they've given me. To Dave for listening and being willing to watch and to help with the perfect amount of critique. To my LHMC peeps, Val, Amanda, McRob, Allie, Marie, thank you guys so much for being my friends and for being just a great part of me getting this started and a wonderful cheering section. And to Sarah, you know who you are. I wish you were 1,000 miles closer so we could brainstorm and do this together. And this is more of a PSA. And it's for anybody thinking about doing a project like this or who hasn't done any podcasting before or any kind of video presentations. These are some software tools that are really very, very helpful. And I just say that I am using the free versions of most of them. I couldn't do it without them. So DaVinci Resolve, I'm still learning this. I had the free version, but it is amazing. Podcastle, fantastic. DID for the AI animation, and 11 Labs for text-to-speech, and Chat GPT/Sora, also for AI animation. Okay, so as I said, I'm super glad that you guys are all here today, and today we are traveling to the Deep South.
This is the story of Attina Marie Cannaday, a 16-year-old girl who would become one of the youngest people ever sentenced to death in the United States. Alongside a much older accomplice, she helped orchestrate the kidnapping and brutal murder of a decorated Air Force sergeant named Ronald Wojcik. And if that isn't unsettling enough, the case involves sex, lies, cassette tapes, and courtroom shock. So buckle up. This isn't just a crime story. It's a step or two back in time, and it's a story about power, poverty, family violence, manipulation, and teen angst, and how all that creates a strange cocktail of murder and vulnerability. Picture this: the Gulf Coast, Biloxi, Mississippi, summer of 1982. The air is heavy with humidity, the insects buzz, and the radio stations are full of country twang but with a pinch of Duran Duran and Rush sprinkled here and there. It's a fishing town and a military town where everybody knows everybody's business. Biloxi is where this crime will occur, but not where it starts. No. This story is rooted 50 miles west along the coast in Mobile, Alabama, where progress moves slower than molasses in January, but gossip, or a family secret, can hit warp speeds.
To understand this crime, we need to understand the two communities, both Biloxi and Mobile, that were immediately involved. First, Biloxi. Before the casinos and the condos, Biloxi in the 1980s was a place where Gulf Coast traditions, military life, and working class grit kind of converged. It was nestled between white sand beaches and a naval airspace, and it was both a tourist town and a town that never stopped working. So let's walk the shorelines of 1980s Biloxi and explore the culture and community that shaped it during this time. Biloxi was defined by its geography. Life here moved to the rhythm of the tides and the seasons. There was shrimping and fishing were lifeblood industries. You'd find families that had worked the Gulf for generations. They were proud of their resilience and their resourcefulness, as they should have been. There was also kind of an easy charm and some southern hospitality with a saltwater edge. Whether you were eating oysters at a dockside cafe, tanning on the beach, or watching your kids play under the palm trees, there was a strong sense that this town was built on endurance and tradition and the sea. The heart of Biloxi's economy and culture was Kessler Air Force Base. In the early 1980s, it was one of the largest employers in the region. It trained thousands of airmen in electronics and in radar systems and in communications. That brought in a constant stream of young recruits, technical instructors and their families from all over the country, and sometimes from all over the globe. It created sort of an interesting cultural dynamic in this part of the deep coastal South. It felt more like a melting pot than some of the other more traditionally Southern cities. One minute you might be talking to a lifelong Biloxian, the next you might be in the bar across from a 19-year-old from Detroit who was learning about radar systems for the U.S. Air Force. Locals and military families mixed in schools, churches, corner stores, and they sometimes clashed. But there was also a mutual understanding. Both groups worked hard and neither took life for granted. Biloxi in the early 1980s was also in the midst of a slow transformation. While the shrimp boats still launched at dawn and beachside motels still hummed in the summer, there were signs of change on the horizon. Desegregation efforts were still being felt in the public schools and in housing. This was only 5 to 7 years after the end of Vietnam, and Vietnam veterans were returning to the Gulf Coast and were re-entering civilian life, reshaping conversations about patriotism, trauma, and opportunity. Hurricane Frederick in 1979 had reminded the whole region just how fragile life on the coast could be. And it sparked new conversations on infrastructure and preparedness. There was a sense of grit to the city, but this wasn't a sleepy beach town. It was a place that survived storms of all kinds, welcomed strangers, and kept moving forward. Biloxi's cultural core rested heavily in family ties and religious life. Catholicism was especially strong due to French and Spanish and Vietnamese influence. You'd hear Mass in English, but you'd also hear it in Vietnamese and Spanish. Local festivals and things like fish fries and bazaars and church fundraisers were staples of social life. It wasn't flashy, but it was tight-knit. Everyone knew someone who had worked on the boats, joined the Air Force, or had a cousin living up in Jackson. 50 miles west along the Gulf Coast is Mobile, Alabama. And this is a place where time feels thick. It feels like the humidity in the air. The streets echo with the clink of Mardi Gras beads from the past, and those not yet thrown or worn. And beneath all of the hype of this party town and the Spanish moss that hangs from the trees, something else lingers, something older and heavier and darker and deeper. Mobile was, and still is, a port city, and it's very much working class. It's also very religious and very proud. In the shadow of steel cranes and church steeples, shipbuilding in the 1980s fueled much of the economy, with jobs at the Alabama State Docks or the old ADSCO shipyard being a primary employer. Oil and gas had crept into the picture too by this time. But by the 1980s, the economic picture was kind of starting to crack in Mobile. Unemployment was rising, factories were slowing down, and the city's undercurrent of inequality still very much alive.
Darling, if Mobile was a southern belle, she'd be holding onto her pearls for dear life. Lace curtains in the front window, crime outside in the alley or down the hall behind a closed door. God forbid anyone talk about it at brunch.
Exactly. Tradition was everything. There was Sunday church, Mardi Gras balls, there were mystic societies, and many of these were still segregated. Black communities, especially neighborhoods like Toulminville and Pritchard, were dealing with underfunded schools and over-policed streets, and there were very few opportunities. Despite the civil rights victories of the 1960s, systemic inequality hadn't gotten very far. Many of the schools have been integrated on paper, but white flight has already happened. There's been a huge number of private academies that opened, and they were only thinly veiled segregation holdouts. Poverty was also an issue. According to data from that time, overall poverty rate in Mobile was about 17%, compared to 13% nationally. And about 39% of Black residents were living in poverty, as compared to about 17% of white residents. And let's not forget the political theater. Mobile was dragging its feet when it came to truly representing citizens. It wasn't until 1987, yes, years later, that a federal court forced the city to redraw its voting map. Crime was ticking up too. Drug trafficking was increasing. There were more burglaries. There were occasional violent outbursts, sort of under this illusion of calm and slow movement. But Mobile didn't like to air its dirty laundry. The genteel mask stayed firmly in place. It was a city with memory and with secrets, the kind of place where names mattered, reputations mattered, and stories sometimes vanished into the silence. So if you're imagining the setting for a crime or a place to raise a criminal, this is it. A city steeped in ritual and resistance, slow to change, but unable to stop it. Mobile in the early 1980s was a place haunted not by ghosts, but by the things it refused to say out loud. And the kids? Well, this was their habitat and their terrain to navigate. Attina was part of a growing demographic, disenfranchised Southern youth with very few options. They were sometimes coming from broken homes, definitely a changing social and political climate, and they had access to just enough culture to dream of more, but not enough support to get there. As one Southern sheriff said years later, you had a whole generation of kids being raised by the TV and whatever parent hadn't walked out yet. I can relate. I'm from that generation as well. Now that we know where these communities are and what it's like to live there and what's happening, we can delve into the life and untimely death of U.S. Air Force Sergeant Ronald Wojcik. And this is a story that intertwines service and love, obsession, and tragedy. It's a narrative that left an indelible mark on the communities of Mississippi and on Alabama, and sparked national conversations about justice and the death penalty. Sergeant Ronald Wojcik was a 26-year-old airman stationed at Kessler Air Force Base in Biloxi, Mississippi. He was a devoted father of two and divorced. He was known for his commitment to service and his role as a father. Ronald was a man who balanced the rigors of military life with the joys and the responsibility of parenthood. In 1982, Ronald also worked at a local bar called the Sports Page, and this is where he met 16-year-old Attina Marie Cannaday. Unaware of her true age, they began a relationship. Upon discovering she was a minor and facing potential repercussions from his superiors and the Air Force in general, Ronald ended the relationship. This decision would have unforeseen and dire consequences. He had unknowingly engaged in a risky behavior, a relationship with a minor, but by all reports, He did the right thing. He ended it when he found out she was only 16, and he did what the military expected of him as well. His murder was not a random act. It was premeditated, and it was personal, and it was brutal. We don't know a lot more about Ronald. Specific details about his hometown, how he grew up, his ex-wife's identity, or their location and date of their divorce are not publicly documented. So we don't know if he was like newly out of his marriage or if he'd been divorced for a while. We do know that he was very involved with his children. But understanding more may have given us an increased understanding of how he eventually got involved with Cannaday and what led to the subsequent crime. On June 3rd, 1982, Ronald and his girlfriend, Sandra Soash, were abducted at knife point by Cannaday, her acquaintance David Gray, and a 15-year-old girl named Dawn Buschert. They were forced into Ronald's van and driven to a secluded area. Sandra ended up managing to escape and alert authorities. Tragically, however, Ronald was not so lucky. He was taken into the woods and murdered. Our victimology tells us that Ronald was a situational victim. He likely didn't see this danger coming. He had little information is available about Sandra Soash before or after her ordeal. According to available records, she was born April 26, 1946, and died February 17, 2004. I was able to find out she was born and died in the United States, but I wasn't able to find out much more biographical data for her. Her experiences on June 13, 1982, would have had a severe and lasting impact on her life. She was certainly a situational victim. She had not even been involved with Cannaday. She just happened to be there. And she was only associated through the perpetrators via her relationship with Ronald Wojcik. As I've said before, I don't really want to put a ton of emphasis on the perpetrators in this series, but we have to know a little bit about this girl to understand how she ended up alone in Biloxi at 16 in a relationship. Enter Attina Marie Cannaday. She was born on September 8th, 1965 in Mobile, Alabama. She had a childhood that reads like a checklist of key indicators to create a social failure for a child. There was abuse, neglect, unstable housing, drug and alcohol abuse. Her mom worked as an exotic dancer in Mobile, and during her childhood, she was sexually abused by her father. Attina dropped out of school by the age of 13 and actually got married that year. She was divorced by the time she was 14. And as a 14-year-old with minimal education, a reported IQ of 71, her options were extremely limited. And she did what people do. She did what she had been taught and what she knew could make her a living and keep her alive. After her divorce at 14, Cannaday obtained a fake ID and worked as an exotic dancer and as a sex worker in Mississippi. It wasn't long before she met Ronald Wojcik. Things might have actually felt like they were looking up a little in life for her in 1982. She'd used her fake ID to get a job in a sports bar, the Sports Page, and that's where she met Ronald. So prior to her brief relationship with the victim, she had formed a friendship with David Gary Randolph, and he was a 28-year-old unemployed man living out of his car. As she progressed through her relationship with Wojcik, she used him as a sounding board for her feelings, much like any teenager would use another person for a sounding board. And she would talk about how she felt about the relationship, how she felt about it ending, and all of the angst that she was experiencing. He would end up becoming the muscle behind her teenage breakup and revenge plot. And while she was absolutely a vulnerable and marginalized teen, with all of the emotional turmoil and drama that comes with teen love, compounded by what sounds like an absolutely horrific childhood, that doesn't make her choices in what she did to Ronald and what was done to Sandra any more excusable. Dawn Buschert was the third and reportedly least involved member of this little kill team. Her juvenile records are locked down tight, and all that I can verify is that she was 15 on the day that the crime occurred. She was charged with murder as an adult, and she did plead guilty to manslaughter.
It's June 3rd, 1982, on the Gulf in Biloxi, Mississippi. It's hot and muggy, and it's after midnight. The night sounds surround a simple one-bedroom apartment where Sergeant Wojcik and his girlfriend Sandra are still up, talking the night away the way you do when you are young and in love and have nothing but time. There is a knock on the door. Not too hard, not threatening, but way too late for a casual visit, right? Ronald and Sandra look at each other puzzled. Then Ronald shrugs and gets up and answers the door. Cannaday and her crew, David Gray and 15-year-old Dawn Bushart, lure Wojcik and his girlfriend from the safety of the apartment. It's not clear how they lured them out. Some sources say it was Attina's promise of sex, but that doesn't ring true since Ronald was hanging out with his girlfriend. However it occurred, they were overpowered and subdued. They were abducted at knife point and forced into Ronald's own van and driven to a secluded area north of Gulfport. During the drive out of town, Cannaday, and probably Bushart, goaded and emboldened Gray to rape Sandra at knife point. Upon reaching the wooded area where they would finally stop, Sandra was able to escape. Meanwhile, Cannaday coldly instructed Gray to kill Wojcik. Gray led Ronald off the road and away from the van, into the woods where he was beaten mercilessly, stabbed and tortured. He was also compelled to make a cassette recording. That recording was chilling. Ronald Wojcik could be heard pleading for his life and trying to reason with his captors. When his body was found the next day, he had been stabbed 19 times, and by some reports, finally shot in the head. The cassette tape was recovered at the scene. After escaping from her abductors, Sandra was able to make her way to a nearby residence. She woke the owners of the property and reported the crime to the Harrison County Sheriff's Department. She gave a detailed account of the abduction, her assault, and what they were doing to Ronald when she got away, as well as a description of the assailants and the vehicle they were abducted in. Her report and the details she was able to give were instrumental in the subsequent investigation and apprehension of the perpetrators.
While the Cannaday case did not directly result in new legislation, it set a precedent in Mississippi that influenced how courts would assess juvenile culpability in sentencing from there on out. It emphasized the necessity for courts to consider the unique characteristics of juvenile offenders, such as their potential for rehabilitation and the impact of their developmental stage on their decision-making. The Cannaday case also contributed to the evolving legal standards occurring in the United States regarding juvenile sentencing. It was among several cases that actually informed national discourse leading up to the U.S. Supreme Court decision in Roper v. Simmons 2005, which held that executing individuals for crimes committed under the age of 18 does violate the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. It also made us look a little bit at our attitudes towards sexual violence and abuse. Cannaday's history of sexual abuse by her father and her early marriage were not seen as particularly problematic in 1982, and certainly not with the same empathy or psychological nuance that might be expected today. By the time of her resentencing, public and legal understanding of childhood trauma and its impact on behavior had begun to deepen, though this was still in its infancy. It also changed how we perceive the roles of people regarding their gender. It also changed how people in Mississippi and throughout the country looked at gender norms. It was absolutely shocking and horrifying that a 16-year-old girl was involved in such a brutal crime, even though we had had Bonnie of Bonnie and Clyde fame a few decades before. Mississippi, much like the rest of the U.S., had rigid gender norms, and Cannaday's actions and background sparked moral outrage and panic. Over time, these conversations evolved into deeper questions about why young women offend, what populations are most likely to become female juvenile offenders, and the roles and weight of coercion and physical and emotional trauma in the crimes committed by juvenile females. This was a case that garnered national attention due to the graphic nature of the crimes, the ages of those involved, and Wojcik's military status. The case drew media coverage from Mississippi throughout the South and even internationally. Public outrage was strong in Harrison County, and particularly on Keesler Air Force Base, where Wojcik served, but it was also strong throughout the U.S. Additionally, Wojcik's murder and Sobosh's assault and Cannaday's role in these crimes helped inspire the 1990s film Too Young to Die, reflecting how public perception had shifted from the late 1980s to the mid-1990s, and interest was growing in how trauma, age, and justice intersected. Mississippi has remained a state with a deep history and traditions, and is a state still grappling with its past, economically stressed, socially conservative, and institutionally rigid. But small cracks have begun to form in those foundations, setting the stage for evolving conversations around juvenile justice, family violence, sexual violence, and trauma-informed sentencing, as well as the impact that all of these issues will have on the communities in decades to come. Locally, communities questions the futures of their children and wanted to know, how do we help them move forward in a more positive manner? In Mobile, at the time of the crime and the trial, quote, a former classmate of Cannaday said she was just a kid. But after that, we all started wondering how well we really knew each other. The same could be said of Mississippi, Alabama, the South, and the nation. In Mississippi, it forced reevaluation of how juvenile offenders are processed and created calls to reform how courts assess the role of coercion and mental health in sentencing. This case helped spark a national debate about juvenile sentencing and the ethics of executing minors and what actually constitutes cruel and unusual punishment, even with the worst of the worst crimes. So to wrap it up, remembering Ronald is not just about recounting a tragedy, it's about honoring the legacy of a man who served his community and his country. This case remains a stark reminder of how easily and cruelly one life can twist and change a person from victim to perpetrator, but that pain, no matter how deep, is never an excuse to harm or accept harm from others.
Well then, viewers and listeners, thank you again for joining us. Your company was relatively tolerable today, and we do so appreciate it. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we can reach more curious viewers just like you. Please join us next week for an unsolved mystery that does not involve a murder or a crime, at least not directly. Until next time, stay aware, stay curious, and remember, some crimes never die. They echo